Today is week 2 of a brand new series, No Offense, and if you missed it, check out our podcasts on week 1. It's taken by our very own Mark Pomeroy. Enjoy it.
Well, hey there, Elevate family. Great to have you with us this week. I want to start by playing a game, and I'm calling this game, Which People Are You? So I'm going to give you 2 options, and you just kind of think to yourself, or if you're hosting a watch party, you're with some friends, maybe just call it out. But here's the game. Which people are you? Question 1. Are you morning people or night people? Question 2, are you coffee people or tea people? All right, not much controversy so far. Let me dial it up a little bit. Are you iPhone people or Android people? All right, let's dial it up a bit more. Those living in Australia, this one's for you. Are you Liberal Party people or Labor Party people? All right, maybe don't answer that one out loud. And let me dial it all the way up for maximum controversy. Are you pro-vaccine mandate people or are you anti-vaccine mandate people? And definitely don't answer that one out loud. But maybe answer this to yourself. When I put that last one up, pro-vaccine mandate, anti-vaccine mandate, did you by any chance feel like a little bit of awkwardness suddenly rise up in you involuntarily? If so, why do you think that is? I haven't made any comments on the matter. I just said 2 groups. And all right, take a big deep breath. Let me put a couple of observations out there. Now, these are Mark Pomeroy observations. These aren't from the Bible, so just understand that. These are just my cultural observations of why some of these topics, politics, vaccine mandates, have become so polarizing, have become so emotive, have become so antagonistic, protagonistic. First of all, media more than ever is competing for eyeballs. And one of the plays that a lot of media outlets use is to create headlines that are clickbait, that will encourage you as you're scrolling your news app and so on and so forth to want to click and then read. And then to want to keep reading. Some of the same media outlets fashion the stories in such a way that they create 2 groups, that they reference 2 groups with essentially diametrically opposing perspectives. And what that can do, because they don't leave any real room for nuance, what that can do is it can cause us to assume there are only 2 groups, that they are at extreme opposites, and it can suck us into feeling compelled, or maybe even without realizing it, joining or identifying with one of these 2 groups, thinking those are the only options available. And also to keep you reading, media articles more often nowadays, it's not enough just to put some facts out there. They need to add some opinions, and it's not just the addition of opinions. That's not a new thing, but what they do is they will find a protagonist and an antagonist, and they'll pit these two people or groups who have very different viewpoints against each other in the article. So once again, if you're reading that, you're thinking firstly that there's only two options, which is not always the case, because a lot of what happens in the world has nuance to it, but also suck us into feeling like we have to join one of those two groups. And this plays out in our everyday when we're in the workplace. You know, we'll have people that have taken one extreme position and people have taken the other extreme position. It'll play out in family settings. It'll play out on social media. And this is where a lot of the damage occurs, because it's not just polarizing perspectives, it ultimately results in polarizing people against each other. And it's removed, or is removing, the ability to have healthy and robust conversations where ideas can be thrown about that don't necessarily overlap. It serves to create an us versus them landscape. And in doing so, we conclude that the only two options that we have when it comes to one of these hot topics is either to shut up and just avoid the conflict, or to just start lobbing grenades at the other group. And when I say the other group, you know, we have a name for them. We call them those people. Those people who are different from us. Those people who think differently from us. Those people who see the world differently to us. And we allow those people to get under our skin. We allow those people to kind of cause us to say and do things that we might regret, you know, that are less than God's best. Let me show you something that God said to his people when they were miles apart from each other in their perspective. And this has been a principle that I've tried to adopt in my life over many years and become my go-to. And it's very different from grenade lobbing at those people. This is what God said through Isaiah to his people who were miles apart from him. He said, "Come now, let us reason together." It was an invitation. You know, he didn't say, let us argue with one another, let us criticize one another. He invited them. In fact, in the Godfather, the movie The Godfather, Marlon Brando, who plays the original Godfather character, he would use this very same exact expression with his enemies. He would say, before they launched full-scale war against each other, he would invite the other family, head of the family, and he would say that, "Come, let us reason together." And they would have what they call a sit-down. And the sole purpose of a sit-down was to create greater understanding through reasoning together. And unfortunately, we're losing, or in fact, in some cases, haven't even developed the ability to reason together. It requires a commitment, and it requires a set of skills. And I'm going to come back to those set of skills, but let's first kind of establish the commitment. And I understand some of why this is problematic, some of why the commitment to and the skill to reason together is on the decline. Number one, when you sit down with someone with a different perspective and want to understand them better, you're more than likely confronted with the reality that you don't know everything. You thought you did, and now you've discovered, oh, actually, my perspective isn't as watertight as I thought it was before we sat down. And so what we too often tend to do is to gravitate towards people who think the same as us, our people, and avoid those people. What I want to put to us today is that a commitment to reasoning together and developing the skills to be good at reasoning together means that disagreeing doesn't have to be terminal to our relationships, that there is something better. So this series we launched last week called No Offense. And I kicked off with just a very simple statement for the title of last week's message: stop taking offense. You know, taking offense robs you of peace and joy. Taking offense robs the people around you of peace and joy. And ultimately, and this is something that James wrote, and we drilled into this, it actually limits our effectiveness to lead people to Jesus. Today I want to teach on dealing with those people, which, full disclosure, it's intentionally a clickbait title. In fact, more accurately, what I want to teach on today is how to disagree well. And that if we learn to disagree well, because disagreement doesn't have to be a negative thing, doesn't have to be a negative experience. And if we learn to disagree well, disagreement doesn't have to be destructive. Destructive to your mental health, destructive to your relationships, destructive to your opportunities to learn a broader perspective, destructive to your opportunities to influence other people. So if you've got your Bible or your Bible app, how about you pop that open to Acts chapter 15. And I'm going to read from the New Living Translation. So this is Acts chapter 15. And the book of Acts is something that Luke, who wrote one of the biographies of Jesus, he kind of segued from the biography of Jesus to now record what's essentially the highlight reel of the early church, the first kind of few decades through to, kind of like the first century of the early church. And one of the things that the early church, particularly in the first 3 to 4 decades after Jesus rose again and ascended into heaven, one of the realities of the early church is that almost exclusively the first Jesus followers were Jewish. They had been raised in the Jewish faith, which Jesus had been also, by the way. And, one by one and one family at a time and one household at a time, some of these Jewish people started to become followers of Jesus. But there was an interesting dynamic that took place, and that was that they continued with their commitment to Judaism, and they added being a Jesus follower on that. And so they would continue with the customs and the practices and the principles of being Jewish. Well, that was okay when there was only one group. However, after the first 3 or 4 decades of the early church, non-Jewish people started to become Jesus followers. And so 2 groups started to emerge: Jewish Jesus followers and non-Jewish Jesus followers, who are often referred to as Gentiles. And this group, the Jewish Jesus followers, they were advocating that the Gentile Jesus followers had to also convert to Judaism. It wasn't enough to become a Jesus follower. They had to convert to Judaism, and in doing so, they had to commit to the principles and practices and beliefs and observations of the Jewish faith. So, enter into this perspective of two differing groups, Paul. Paul, who was one of the early leaders in the church, and by the way, before he became a Jesus follower, he was one of the leaders in the Jewish faith. And he started questioning this expectation that Gentile Jesus followers had to become Jewish Jesus followers. And that was very controversial at the time. Nothing new when I say this. It was very polarizing, that perspective. And in fact, it forced the two groups further apart. Sound familiar? Well, this is what Luke recorded. While Paul and Barnabas were at Antioch of Syria, some men from Judea arrived and began to teach the believers. Unless you are circumcised as required by the law of Moses, you cannot be saved. So that's the point. They're saying to the Gentile Jesus followers that salvation has to include becoming Jewish. Paul and Barnabas disagreed with them, arguing vehemently. Finally, the church decided to send Paul and Barnabas to Jerusalem, accompanied by some local believers, to talk to the apostles and elders about this question, to have a sit down, to reason together. Well, when Paul and Barnabas and the group that went with them got to Jerusalem, they gathered with the broader leadership of the early church. The apostles and elders met together to resolve this issue. So that was their intended purpose. At the meeting, after a long discussion, Peter stood and addressed them. Then, next, everyone listened quietly as Barnabas and Paul told them about the miraculous signs and wonders God had done through them among the Gentiles. Then, when they'd finished, James stood. Now, you're hanging on a thread. What happened next? Well, you can read it for yourself. But I can say this, that the church leaders, having reasoned together, came up with a resolution, and they announced that resolution, and Paul and Barnabas left the meeting happy with the outcome. It gives a great demonstration of the power of both the commitment to reasoning together and having the set of skills to be able to reason together well. Now, it's important to understand that going into that meeting, going into that sit down, there was no guarantee that they were going to come out with a positive outcome. There was no guarantee that these two perspectives were actually going to come together with greater understanding. But here's the question that I want you to ask yourself is, do you think they would have ever even got close to coming up with a resolution if their intent, their motivation wasn't to reason together, but instead to argue with one another, to criticize one another, to throw grenades at one another? I'm going to say it for you. No, absolutely not. That's not how we reason together. And here's a clue in that account. Verse 12, everyone listened quietly as Barnabas and Paul spoke, which aligns exactly with something that I taught on last week, that James instructed us to do. Lead with your ears, follow up with your tongue, and let anger, if at all, straggle along in the rear. So I said numerous times already that reasoning together well requires both a commitment and a set of skills. The Liam Neeson, a very particular set of skills. All right? Here's some skills. Here's some of what I'm calling the reasoning well toolkit. Throw them in your toolkit and continue to develop them. First of all, assess your trust platform. With the person or the people that you have decided to have a sit down with, to get greater understanding, to reason together, assess your trust platform. You are probably going to want to approach things slightly differently with the person or people you've developed a deep and wide trust platform with versus somebody that you barely know. Because with someone that you barely know, you have to be more careful because there isn't the history of understanding. You don't know each other well. You don't, versus somebody or a group of people you've got a deep and wide trust platform with. So first of all, going into the sit down, going into the conversation, assess your trust platform and let that inform and guide some of how you approach the process of reasoning together. Secondly, ask questions. You know, the person or the people, they have a different perspective than you. That's the point. And so you can ask them, you know, help me understand how you came to your current perspective. What kind of sources have informed your journey to arrive at this position? I'm keen to learn. I have a different position currently, but I'm guessing my position's not complete. And so, yeah, it will be helpful to just hear from you your perspective and why you have that perspective. Then, remember, lead with your ears, follow up with your tongue. As you have heard or are hearing their perspective and their whys and their reasoning and some of, you know, what's informed their perspective, if you feel there's any value in maybe offering up your perspective that's different from theirs, just ask permission. You know, don't pull the pin of the grenade and lob it back at them. That's not the point of reasoning together. So you might just say something like, okay, I'm not sure I agree with everything that you've put out there. Do you mind if I, like, just for the sake of developing greater understanding with you, if I could kind of put a few of my thoughts on the table or my why on the table, how I've come to the perspective that I've come to you? And by the way, that's not one of the problems, and I'll come to this next in the toolkit, is one of the problems or the sticking points with reasoning together is too often things become personal and we get kind of spun up and we lose sight of the actual facts and perspectives and issues on the table, and we start to potentially get combative and make it personal, which will cause your reasoning to break down just about quicker than anything. So here's my final tool to put in your reasoning toolkit, and that is to monitor your emotions. You know, if as you're in this conversation with this other person or other people, and you're finding that your emotions are escalating, then take a time out. Just be honest. Say, listen, I'm sorry to have to admit this, but I'm getting a little worked up here, and I'm afraid that if I don't take a time out, that I'm going to actually damage this process. So look, please, if you don't mind, let's take a time out and let's regroup, but I just need to kind of cool my jets a little bit. And great, what an incredibly respectful, what an incredibly healthy thing to do. And again, and that, just even that, will build trust. That you have been thoughtful enough for the other person that you don't want to intentionally do damage. So you recognize that your commitment to one another is more important than your disagreement with one another. Hey, that's just a quick flyover. I mean, this is not necessarily a Jesus follower issue. This is a people issue. Yet I do believe as Jesus followers, we ought to be the best on the planet, the best at doing people well, the best at doing leadership well, the best at doing influence well. So this stuff really matters. And while the cultural arc of media and politicians and various commentators maybe is going one direction, let's rise up and let's take back some ground. Let's reframe the conversation. Let's model to our friends and those in our spheres of influence a better way to disagree. Next week, we're going to land this series, third and final week. And by the way, if you missed last week, of course, go back and watch or jump in our podcast. All of the major podcast platforms, just type in Elevate Church Perth. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast there. And you'll find last week's message. Next week, I'm going to teach on what to do when bitterness takes over. Because really, last week's message and today's message is really kind of focused on the preventative side of things. You know, we like to say better a fence at the top of the hill than to need an ambulance at the bottom. However, I'm aware that maybe some of you have caused offense and disagreement to do some damage. And you're kind of at the bottom of the hill needing some urgent medical attention. Maybe have some bitterness and some anger inside you. Well, let's talk about that next week. Let's have a healthy conversation about what to do when bitterness takes over. So I would love to see you then and love to have you invite some of your friends to join you as well.